The alarm in the training yard had not even finished its first note when I saw every Predator cadet in the courtyard step back at once. I am Owen Vance, an officer of the Veyron Fleet, assigned as a liaison instructor at the Coalition Academy. I have spent 11 years around species built to hunt, built to dominate, built to make weaker creatures run. I thought I understood fear. I thought I understood what made a killer's instincts fire. Then I watched a group of Drogan cadets, each one twice my height, each one carrying claws that could open a hull plate, quietly rearrange themselves around a single human woman crossing the courtyard. She was not armed, she was not shouting, she was not doing anything, except walking to the mess hall with a data tablet under her arm. Her name was Naomi Clark, and she was, on paper, the least remarkable cadet in her entire class. I want to tell you what I saw that morning, because it changed the way I think about strength, about fear, and about the strange, quiet species that decided to send its children into the stars. The Coalition Academy sits on a ring station above the neutral world of Asteris, built specifically so that dozens of species could train together without one homeworld's gravity or atmosphere giving any single group an advantage. Every day, cadets from a dozen worlds crossed paths in the same corridors, ate in the same halls, trained in the same simulation domes. Most species kept to their own kind out of habit, not hostility. Predators sat with predators. Herd species sat with herd species. It was simple biology, nothing more. But there was one exception to every grouping, every table, every training pod, and that exception always sat alone. I first noticed Naomi 3 weeks into the term, not because she stood out, but because she did not. She was of average height for a human, dark-haired, quiet-spoken, the kind of cadet an instructor might forget to call on during roll. She scored well in tactics and mediocre in piloting. She was not the fastest runner in her cohort, not the strongest in the weight trials, not the sharpest marksman on the range. By every measurement the Academy used, she was ordinary. And yet, whenever she walked into a room, something changed. It was subtle enough that I almost missed it the first few times. A Drogan cadet named Keswick, who I had watched casually intimidate a room full of senior officers just by entering it, would go quiet and slightly rearrange his stance the moment Naomi crossed his path. A pair of wren twins, whose species hunted in coordinated pairs and rarely showed uncertainty about anything, would exchange a glance and take the long way around the corridor, rather than pass close to her. At first, I assumed it was some kind of prejudice. Humans were still new to the wider coalition, and new things often made older species uneasy. I filed it away as a cultural friction to monitor, nothing more. Then I watched it happen with an instructor. Commander Threl Vashko was a war veteran of the Drogan military caste, a being who had led void assaults against hostile fleets before humanity had even developed sublight travel. He did not fear anything. He had told me so himself, more than once, usually while explaining why some safety protocol was unnecessary for someone of his combat record. I watched him pause mid-sentence during a lecture, look toward the back row where Naomi sat quietly taking notes, and lose his train of thought entirely. He recovered after a moment, cleared his throat, and continued the lecture as if nothing had happened. But his hand, resting on the podium, had curled into a fist for just a second before he made himself relax it. I asked him about it afterward, carefully, the way you ask a proud species about something that might embarrass them. He told me it was nothing. He told me humans had an unusual presence, that was all. Something about the way their species carried themselves. He said this while very deliberately not looking in the direction of the human dormitory wing. I did not believe him, not because I thought he was lying, but because I could see that he did not fully understand it either. So I began to watch more closely. I watched the training yard every morning for 2 weeks, standing near the observation rail with a data pad, pretending to review cadet performance logs while actually recording something else entirely. I watched how cadets moved around each other. I watched who avoided whom, who challenged whom, who postured and who yielded. It is a language older than any spoken tongue, and once you learn to read it, you cannot stop seeing it. What I found unsettled me. Every predator species on that station, without exception, gave Naomi Clark space. Not obvious space, not the kind of space you would notice unless you were looking for it, a half step wider when passing her in the corridor, a slight change in the angle of the shoulders, a pause before speaking directly to her, as if choosing words more carefully than usual. The strange part was that Naomi never seemed to notice any of it. She was not walking around with confidence or swagger. She was not staring anyone down or asserting dominance the way predator species did when establishing rank. She simply walked, sat, trained, and ate, exactly the way any quiet, unremarkable person might. There was no performance in it, no effort. And that, I would later come to understand, was exactly the problem. I decided to speak with her directly, more out of professional curiosity than anything else. I found her in the observation deck one evening, alone, watching the stars slide past the station's rotation with the kind of stillness most cadets her age could not manage for more than a few seconds. I introduced myself. She was polite, unremarkable, exactly as her file described. I asked her how she found the academy so far. She said it was fine, a little quiet. She missed home a bit, but the training was good. I asked her, as gently as I could manage, whether she had noticed that other cadets tended to give her a wide space. She looked at me for a long moment, and I saw something cross her face that I would only understand much later. It was not confusion. It was recognition. The kind of recognition a person has when someone finally asks about something they had never thought worth mentioning. She said, "I thought that was just how everyone here acts around new species. I didn't want to make it weird by asking." I told her it was not how everyone acted around new species. I told her it was specifically how they acted around her. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said something I would not forget. She said, "Back home, my grandmother used to say some rooms just get quieter when certain people walk into them. She never explained why. I guess I never thought it would follow me this far." I did not understand what she meant that night. I filed the conversation away as another strange piece of a puzzle I could not yet assemble. It would take an incident in the deep simulation dome, 3 weeks later, for me to finally understand exactly what kind of quiet she carried with her, and exactly why every apex predator on that station had been backing away from a woman who had never once raised her voice. Because what I did not know yet, what none of us fully understood, was that Naomi Clark came from a world where the quiet ones were often the most dangerous of all, not because of what they carried in their hands, but because of what several million years of history had carved into their bones. A world the Coalition's own registry listed under a single, unassuming word: Deathworld. I had read that classification 100 times in briefing documents, without ever once stopping to ask what it truly meant for the people who grew up there. I was about to find out, and so was everyone else on that station who had made the mistake of underestimating the quiet cadet who always walked alone. After that conversation on the observation deck, I could not stop thinking about the word Deathworld. I had used it before, in reports, in casual conversation, the way any officer uses a classification without truly examining it. So I did what any curious researcher would do. I pulled every scrap of information the Coalition had on record about the planet called Earth, and I began to read. What I found took me 3 full nights to process, and by the end of it, I understood why an entire species of hardened warriors instinctively stepped aside for a woman who had never so much as raised her voice in a classroom. Earth's registry file began simply enough: standard gravity, breathable atmosphere, moderate temperature range, similar to a few dozen other worlds in the Coalition database. On the surface, nothing about it seemed unusual. It was the details beneath the summary that told a different story. The planet's surface was covered in an almost absurd variety of climates, from freezing poles to burning deserts, from deep oceans to towering mountain ranges, often within the same small region. Most worlds in the Coalition settle into a single dominant biome, shaped by gentle, steady evolutionary pressure over millions of years. Earth had dozens of biomes fighting for dominance at once, each one filled with its own collection of predators, parasites, toxins, and natural disasters. I read about creatures that could kill with a single touch, plants that had evolved chemical defenses so potent they could stop a heart in minutes, weather patterns that could level entire settlements without warning. I read about diseases so small they were invisible to the naked eye, capable of ending a life in days, and about a history of humanity constantly adapting new ways to survive them. And then I found the part of the file that made me sit back in my chair and simply stare at the wall for several minutes. Humans were not the strongest species on their planet. They were not the fastest, not the most heavily armored, not equipped with claws or venom or natural weapons of any kind. By nearly every measurable physical standard, Humans should have been near the bottom of their planet's food chain. Instead, they were at the top of it. I began cross-referencing historical records the Academy had gathered from human diplomatic exchanges, and the picture that formed was staggering. Humans had spent their entire evolutionary history being hunted, and had responded not by growing bigger claws or thicker hides, but by developing something far more dangerous. Endurance, patience, the ability to work together in coordinated groups, to plan several steps ahead, to remain calm in situations that would send other species into blind panic. There was a term in one of the older anthropological records that stuck with me: persistence hunting. It described a hunting method some human ancestors had used, in which they would track a much faster, much stronger animal, for hours, sometimes days, not by outrunning it, but by simply refusing to stop following it, until the animal collapsed from exhaustion. No claws, no venom, no overwhelming strength. Just the quiet, terrifying patience to keep going long after any sensible creature would have given up. I thought about Keswick, the Drogan cadet who could sprint faster than almost anyone on the station, and I wondered what it might mean to be hunted not by something faster than you, but by something that simply never stopped. The file went further still. I found records describing human history filled with wars, disasters, plagues, and famines, each one an event that should have, by any reasonable measure, ended their story as a species. And yet every single time, they had adapted, rebuilt, and continued forward. Their homeworld had tried, in 1,000 different ways across 100,000 years, to remove them from its surface, and every single time, humanity had simply refused to leave. I began to understand, slowly, why the Coalition Registry used the word Deathworld with such careful weight. It was not a description of danger to visitors. It was a description of what it took to survive there at all. And Naomi Clark had grown up on that world, in a body built for exactly that kind of survival, carrying instincts shaped by all of it, whether she consciously realized it or not. I requested access to her personal file, with proper authorization, curious to understand what her specific upbringing had been like. Nothing in it suggested a life of exceptional danger. She had grown up in a modest town, attended standard schooling, spent her free time in what humans called outdoor recreation, hiking, camping, long-distance running through forested trails, sometimes alone, sometimes for entire weekends at a time. To a human reader, this file would have looked like the record of an ordinary, even quiet childhood. To me, reading it with fresh context, it read like a survival record. She had spent her weekends walking for hours through terrain filled with predators her species had learned to coexist with rather than eliminate. She had slept outdoors in conditions that would have required my own people to bring full environmental shielding. She had, by human standards, done nothing unusual at all. I began to reconsider every reading I had taken during my observations of her physiology in the training yard. The Academy's medical monitors had flagged something strange about Naomi's baseline readings during her admission physical, something the medical staff had noted with mild concern, but ultimately dismissed as an anomaly of her species. Her resting heart rate under simulated threat conditions barely changed, where most cadets, human and otherwise, showed clear spikes and stress markers when facing a hostile simulation. Naomi's readings remained almost unnervingly steady. At the time, the medical team had written it off as a quirk of individual physiology, nothing more than statistical noise. Now, with everything else I had learned, I began to wonder if it was something else entirely. Not an anomaly, a baseline, the natural resting state of a species that had spent its entire evolutionary history needing to remain calm in the presence of danger, because panic on Earth had never been a winning strategy. Panic got you killed. Calm, patient, steady thinking was what let a soft, clawless, fangless creature climb to the top of a planet that had tried everything in its power to keep it down. I brought my findings to Commander Vashko, curious what his reaction might be. He listened quietly as I explained what I had learned, his expression unreadable in the way that most Drogan expressions were to someone untrained in reading them. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment before speaking. He told me that on his own homeworld, young Drogan were taught from an early age to recognize the signs of another predator sizing them up. A change in posture, a shift in breathing, a stillness that meant a creature was calculating rather than fleeing. He said that instinct had kept his species alive through countless conflicts, long before they had built their first starship. He said that instinct had been firing every single time Naomi Clark walked into a room, and that it had taken him weeks to understand why, because nothing about her outward behavior matched what that instinct was screaming at him. She was not sizing anyone up. She was not calculating an attack. She was simply calm, in the same effortless way a person might be calm sitting in their own home, and every predator instinct built over millions of years of Drogon history was reading that unshakable calm as something far more dangerous than aggression. It was reading it as confidence that came from having already survived worse. I asked him if he thought Naomi was a threat. He considered the question carefully before answering, the way a good officer always does. He said that on any other world, in any other context, he did not believe she meant harm to anyone. But he said that his instincts were not built to evaluate intention. They were built to evaluate danger. And on that particular measurement, something in him simply could not stop registering her as one of the most dangerous cadets on the entire station, even though every observable fact about her behavior suggested the exact opposite. I left that conversation with more questions than answers, but one thing had become clear to me. Whatever was happening around Naomi Clark was not going to stay a quiet curiosity for much longer. The Academy's final trial for her cohort was approaching, a live simulation exercise designed to test each cadet's ability to respond to a genuine, overwhelming threat. And for the first time since her arrival, I found myself deeply concerned about what might happen when that calm, patient, Deathworld instinct was placed directly in the path of something built, quite literally, to be an apex predator. I did not have to wait long to find out. The final trial was held in the Deep Simulation Dome, a massive spherical chamber built to project full sensory environments so realistic that cadets often forgot they were still standing on a station and not on the surface of another world. I was assigned to observe from the control gallery, alongside Commander Vashko and two senior instructors, watching the trial unfold through a wall of monitors that showed every angle of the dome floor. The exercise had a simple premise. Each cadet cohort would be placed in a simulated wilderness environment and given a survival objective: reach a designated extraction point before a set time limit expired. What made this particular trial different from the dozens of survival exercises the cadets had already completed was the addition of a live variable, something the Academy had never used on a first-year cohort before. A Carvex. I had encountered Carvex specimens twice before in my career, both times in controlled research settings, and both times I had left the encounter with a healthy respect for exactly how dangerous the species could be. They were an apex predator caste, engineered generations ago by a since-collapsed empire as living weapons, then later protected under coalition conservation law once their creators were gone. Roughly the size of a large transport vehicle, covered in dense armored hide, capable of short bursts of speed that could close 100 meters before a person had time to fully process what they were seeing. The Academy kept a single Carvex in a secure containment habitat beneath the station, specifically for advanced training exercises, always under heavy restraint, always monitored by multiple redundant safety systems. For this trial, it would be released into the simulation dome, in a controlled, non-lethal capacity, its natural weapons dulled by safety restraints, but its full instinctive behavior otherwise unaltered. The cadets would not know it was coming. Their objective was simply to react. I want to be clear that nothing about this exercise was meant to put the cadets in genuine danger. The restraints on the Carvex had been tested extensively. But restraints or not, an apex predator moving at full speed toward a group of unarmed cadets is not an experience easily forgotten, and the Academy fully expected panic, scattering, and a wide range of tactical failures. That was, in fact, the entire point of the trial. Learning how to respond to true fear was considered just as important as learning how to fight. The cohort entered the simulated terrain, a dense forested environment with rocky outcroppings and a shallow river cutting through the center. 12 cadets in total, including Naomi Clark, moving in a loose formation toward the extraction point marked on their tactical displays. I watched Keswick take point, his species naturally suited to scouting terrain, with the Wren twins close behind him, and Naomi walking near the rear of the group, quiet as always, scanning the tree line with the same unhurried attention she brought to everything. 11 minutes into the exercise, the Carvex was released. The forest around the cohort erupted with sound, snapping branches, A deep guttural noise the simulation dome reproduced with unsettling accuracy, and then the creature itself burst from the tree line, at a speed that made several instructors in the control gallery visibly flinch. I watched the cadets scatter almost instantly, exactly as predicted, breaking formation and sprinting for whatever cover the terrain offered. Two of them tripped over exposed roots in their panic. The Wren twins, usually so coordinated, split in opposite directions, their pairing instincts overridden entirely by pure survival reflex. Keswick, to his credit, turned to face the threat directly, drawing his training weapon, though even his movements showed the unmistakable stiffness of genuine fear. Naomi Clark did not run. I leaned forward in the control gallery, along with everyone else in the room, as we watched her do something that made absolutely no sense, according to every behavioral model the Academy had on file. She stepped sideways, calmly, putting a large rock formation between herself and the Carvex's direct line of approach, and then she simply stopped moving. Commander Vashko made a low sound beside me that I had never heard him make before. The Carvex's charge shifted direction almost immediately, its predatory instincts drawn toward the movement and panic of the scattering cadets, rather than the single still figure near the rock formation. It closed on one of the fallen cadets, a young Wren who had stumbled and was struggling to get back to their feet, and for a moment, I genuinely believed we were about to witness the trial's safety systems activate in an emergency intervention. Then Naomi moved again. She did not run toward the creature, she did not shout or wave her arms the way some species instinctively do when trying to redirect a predator's attention through noise and motion. Instead, she picked up a heavy branch from the forest floor and struck it hard against the rock formation. 3 sharp, deliberate impacts, evenly spaced, controlled. The sound cut through the chaos of the simulation with startling clarity, and the Carvex's charge faltered. I had read, during my research into Earth's history, about ancient human hunting techniques that used exactly this kind of controlled, rhythmic sound to redirect the attention of dangerous animals, a method passed down through countless generations of people who had needed to protect their communities from creatures far stronger than themselves. I had read about it as historical trivia. I had never expected to watch it deployed, calmly and precisely, in a live training exercise against a genetically engineered apex predator. The Carvex turned toward the new sound and new sudden movement, its enormous head swinging in Naomi's direction, and for a long, terrible moment, every person in the control gallery held their breath. She did not flinch. She did not step back. She stood perfectly still beside the rock formation, branch still in hand, and watched the creature approach with the same unhurried attention she gave everything else. I remember thinking, quite clearly, that I was about to witness something none of us would be able to undo, restraints or no restraints. The Carvex closed the distance to within a few meters, and then, for the first time in the entire exercise, it stopped. It did not attack, it did not retreat. It simply stood there, its massive head lowered, its breathing audible even through the dome's audio pickups, regarding the small, still, unarmed figure in front of it, with what I can only describe as uncertainty. I had never seen a Carvex display uncertainty in any previous observation. Every record on file described their behavior as relentlessly, singularly aggressive once a target was selected. Naomi did not move. She did not lower the branch, but she did not raise it either. She simply stood, breathing slow and even, meeting the creature's attention without challenge and without fear, and I understood, watching her, that I was seeing exactly what Commander Vashko had described weeks earlier. It's a stillness that was not surrender and was not aggression, a calm that came from somewhere far older than the training she had received at the Academy. The standoff lasted perhaps 8 seconds, though it felt considerably longer to everyone watching. Then the Carvex made a low sound, different from its earlier roar, something closer to a rumble, and slowly, deliberately, it turned away from her and retreated back toward the tree line, its handlers moving in immediately to secure it under the exercise's safety protocols. The dome fell silent except for the ragged breathing of the scattered cadets, all of whom were now staring at Naomi Clark with expressions I did not need a translator to understand. In the control gallery, nobody spoke for several seconds. Then one of the senior instructors, an older Threll officer named Idris Calder, who had overseen Carvex trials for over a decade, said quietly that in all his years of running this exercise, he had never once seen the creature disengage from a chosen target, without physical intervention from the safety team. Commander Vashko was staring at the monitor with an expression I had never seen on him before, something between recognition and unease. He said, almost to himself, that the Carvex had not retreated because it was afraid of losing. He said it had retreated because, for the first time in its engineered existence, it had encountered something that did not register as prey, and did not register as a rival worth the cost of a fight. I asked him what that meant, exactly, in terms he could explain to someone outside his species. He said that in the oldest hunting traditions of his people, before they had built ships or weapons of any kind, there had been a specific kind of encounter every predator learned to recognize and respect. Not a fight you could win easily. Not a fight you could win without real cost. An opponent whose stillness told you, without a single word, that fighting them would take more out of you than you were willing to lose, regardless of the outcome. He said that instinct existed in nearly every predator species across the coalition, carved by evolution into something almost universal, a silent language spoken in posture and breath, and the simple, terrible willingness to stand still in the face of overwhelming danger. He said Naomi Clark had just spoken that language fluently, without any training from the academy at all, and every predator on that station, human-trained or otherwise, was about to understand exactly what that meant. In the days following the trial, I found myself unable to stop thinking about what Commander Vashko had said in the control gallery, a silent language spoken in posture and breath. I had spent years studying species interaction across the coalition, and yet I had never once considered that fear and respect might share the same root, the same ancient grammar, written into the nervous systems of creatures who had spent their evolutionary history deciding, in the space of a single heartbeat, whether a fight was worth having. I requested access to the Academy's full behavioral archive on the Carvex species, along with historical records from every documented predator caste in the coalition, curious whether Vashko's explanation held up under closer examination. What I found was more consistent and more fascinating than I had expected. Nearly every predator species in the galactic record shared some version of what researchers called cost assessment behavior. Before committing to a fight, especially against an unfamiliar opponent, predators instinctively evaluated a range of signals: the size and strength of the target, its speed, its apparent confidence, and most importantly, its response to the threat of confrontation itself. A creature that fled provided a clear, simple signal: prey, easy to catch, low cost. A creature that postured aggressively, puffing itself up, bearing weapons, provided a different signal: rival, potentially costly, worth a careful approach. But a creature that did neither, that simply stood still, breathing evenly, radiating no panic and no aggression at all, provided the most unsettling signal of them all. Unknown cost, possibly unacceptable cost. I spoke with Idris Calder, the senior instructor who had overseen Carvex trials for over a decade, hoping to understand the biological mechanics behind what we had all witnessed in the dome. He explained that the Carvex, despite being engineered rather than naturally evolved, had inherited much of its behavioral programming from ancient predator lineages used in its creation. Its instincts were, in every meaningful sense, real predator instincts, refined over countless generations before any of it had been artificially accelerated. He told me that stillness, real stillness, the kind that comes from a creature that has genuinely made peace with the possibility of a fight rather than merely suppressing panic, is exceptionally rare across the galaxy. Most species, when frightened, either flee or perform aggression as a kind of bluff, a costly display meant to convince a predator to look elsewhere before the bluff is tested. Very few species possess the physiological ability to simply remain calm, without performance, without bluff, in the genuine presence of overwhelming danger. He said humans appeared to be one of them, and he said it in a tone that suggested he found this both remarkable and slightly unsettling. I began digging further into human history, searching specifically for the origins of this trait, and found records suggesting it was not a rare individual quality among humans, but something closer to a species-wide baseline, hardened over an evolutionary history defined by constant exposure to danger that could not be outrun, outfought, or bluffed away. On a world filled with predators far stronger and faster than any single human, running was often not an option, and posturing rarely worked against something with no capacity to be intimidated by display alone. The only strategy that consistently worked, across thousands of generations, was patience. Calm, steady, unglamorous patience, paired with an ability to think clearly under pressure that other species simply never needed to develop to the same degree. I thought about how that single evolutionary pressure, applied consistently over hundreds of thousands of years, might shape not just behavior, but the deep, involuntary signals a body sends without conscious thought. With heart rate, breathing, muscle tension, the subtle language of stillness that every predator species had learned, through their own long histories, to read as a warning sign. Humans were not projecting confidence when they stood their ground. They were simply calm, in the same effortless, unconscious way any person is calm in their own home, and to a species built to detect exactly that kind of calm as a signal of genuine danger, it read as something close to a living warning label. I brought these findings back to Commander Vashko, along with a question that had been sitting uncomfortably in my mind since the trial. I asked him whether he believed the other cadets, the ones who had scattered in panic during the exercise, had done anything wrong. He said no, immediately, without hesitation. He said fear was not a failure. Fear was simply the honest response of a creature encountering something its instincts correctly identified as dangerous. He said the scattering cadets had, in fact, done exactly what evolution had designed them to do, and that there was no shame in an instinct that had kept an entire species alive across its own long history. What made Naomi different was not that she was braver than her classmates. It was that her particular evolutionary history had shaped a different baseline entirely, one where the instinct to freeze and assess, rather than flee or bluff, had been the trait that survived and passed forward, generation after generation, on a world that offered no other option. I asked him what would happen now, whether the Academy would treat Naomi differently going forward. He was quiet for a long moment before answering. He said the Academy's threat assessment protocols would need to be reconsidered, not because Naomi posed any danger to anyone, but because the instructors needed to understand why so many Predator caste cadets had been instinctively avoiding a completely peaceful, cooperative classmate for weeks, without anyone noticing the pattern, until it very nearly became a serious incident during a live trial. He said something else, too, something that stayed with me long after our conversation ended. He said that in all his years of service, he had encountered exactly two kinds of dangerous beings: those who wanted to prove how dangerous they were, and those who never thought about it at all, because it had simply never occurred to them that anyone would need reminding. He said Naomi Clark belonged, without question, to the second kind, and that the second kind was always, without exception, the one worth watching most carefully. Word of the incident spread through the Academy quickly, as these things always do, and I began to notice a subtle shift in how other cadets approached Naomi in the days that followed. It was not fear exactly, though fear remained a part of it. It was something closer to careful curiosity, the kind of attention a species gives something it has just learned to properly respect, rather than casually misunderstand. Keswick, the Drogon cadet who had led the cohort into the forest that day, approached her directly during a training session, an act that surprised nearly everyone who witnessed it. I was not present for the full conversation, but Naomi mentioned it to me briefly afterward. She said Keswick had simply asked her, quite bluntly, what she had been thinking during those 8 seconds facing down the Carvex. She told me her answer had been almost embarrassingly simple. She had not been thinking about winning or losing. She had been thinking about distance, timing, and the fact that panicking would only make things worse. She said this was not bravery in her mind. It was just what her grandmother had taught her to do when facing something bigger than herself, a lesson passed down through a family that had, in one way or another, been managing exactly that kind of situation for longer than anyone could properly trace. I found myself thinking, more than once in those following days, about how strange it was that an entire species could carry something so profound, so lightly, treating it as nothing more than practical advice from a grandmother, rather than the product of hundreds of thousands of years spent surviving a planet that had tried, in every conceivable way, to remove them from its surface. The Academy would go on to revise its cadet integration protocols within the month, adding new guidance for how predator caste species should be briefed when training alongside human cadets. But before any official changes were made, before any formal reports were filed, I found myself simply wanting to understand one more thing, something none of the data files or behavioral archives could tell me. I wanted to ask Naomi herself what it felt like to walk through the world the way she did, entirely unaware of the quiet effect she had on everyone around her, for as long as she had. I would get my chance sooner than I expected. 2 weeks after the trial in the deep simulation dome, I found Naomi Clark exactly where I usually did, sitting alone on the observation deck, watching the slow rotation of the stars beyond the station's outer viewport. I had come there with a purpose this time, not simply curiosity, and she seemed to sense it the moment I sat down beside her. I told her everything I had learned since our first conversation weeks earlier. I told her about the research into Earth's history, the persistence hunters who had once tracked prey across entire landscapes through patience alone. I told her about the Carvex's ancient predatory instincts, and about cost assessment behavior, and about the strange, quiet language spoken in stillness and breath that nearly every predator species across the galaxy seemed to share. I told her what Commander Vashko had said, about the two kinds of dangerous beings, and how she had never once needed reminding of which kind she was. She listened to all of it without interrupting, her expression thoughtful rather than surprised, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long moment before speaking. She told me that where she came from, nobody really talked about it directly. It was not a secret, exactly. It was simply not something people thought to explain, the way you would not explain to someone why water was wet, or why the sky changed color at sunset. It had always just been there, part of the background of ordinary life, something absorbed rather than taught. She told me about her childhood, about weekends spent hiking through forests with her grandmother, who had grown up in a rural part of the world, where encounters with large, dangerous animals were an accepted, occasional part of daily life. She said her grandmother had taught her, almost casually, the same way another family might teach a child to ride a bicycle, how to walk calmly through territory that did not belong to her, how to recognize the difference between curiosity and true threat in an animal's posture, and most importantly, how to remain still and steady when every instinct screamed at her to run. She said her grandmother had told her once that panic was the only thing on Earth more dangerous than the animals themselves, because panic made you predictable, and predictable was the one thing you could never afford to be around something bigger and faster than you. I asked her if she had ever felt afraid, during any of those childhood encounters, or during the trial in the simulation dome. She thought about the question carefully before answering, the same unhurried thoughtfulness she seemed to bring to everything. She said fear was not really the word for it. She said what she felt in those moments was closer to focus, a kind of narrowing of attention, where everything unnecessary simply fell away, leaving only the immediate details that actually mattered. Distance, timing. What was within reach, what was not. She said her body had never learned to translate danger into panic the way it seemed to for some of her classmates, and she had honestly never questioned why, until the moment I first asked her about the space other cadets gave her in the corridors. She said something then that I have thought about often since. She said she had always assumed everyone experienced the world roughly the way she did, and it had never occurred to her that her calm might look, to someone else, like something closer to danger. I told her about the shift happening across the academy, about instructors quietly revising behavioral protocols, about predator caste cadets approaching her with a kind of careful curiosity rather than casual avoidance. I asked her how it felt, now that she understood the reason behind something that had followed her, unexplained, for her entire time at the academy. She smiled slightly, the first time I had seen her do so in any of our conversations, and said it felt strange, but not unwelcome. She said she had spent most of her life feeling like the quiet one, the unremarkable one, the person nobody paid much attention to in a room full of louder, more obviously impressive people. She said it was strange to learn that the quiet itself had been the remarkable part all along, even if nobody, including herself, had noticed it until now. I asked her if she had noticed a change in how her classmates treated her since the trial. She said yes, though not in the way I might expect. Keswick had begun sitting near her occasionally during meals, something he had never done before, and had started asking her questions about human history and human hunting traditions with genuine interest rather than polite obligation. The Wren twins, who had once taken deliberately long routes to avoid passing close to her, now greeted her by name in the corridors, their earlier caution replaced by something closer to respectful familiarity. Even Commander Vashko had begun addressing her differently during lectures, calling on her more often, treating her contributions with a weight I had not noticed him giving other first-year cadets. She said she appreciated it, though she also admitted she sometimes missed the simplicity of being overlooked, back when she had assumed her isolation was simply a quiet, unremarkable fact of being new somewhere unfamiliar. We sat together for a while longer, watching the stars continue their slow rotation past the viewport, and I found myself asking one final question, the one that had been sitting at the center of my curiosity since the very beginning of all this. I asked her if she thought there were others like her back on Earth, other humans who carried this same quiet, unshakable calm, without ever realizing what it meant to species who had spent their entire history learning to fear exactly that trait. She said she imagined there were many. She said Earth's history was full of people who had walked calmly into danger, not because they were fearless, but because their world had never given them the luxury of panic as a survival strategy. She said humanity as a species had simply never had the option to be anything other than steady, patient, and quietly relentless, and she suspected that trait ran through nearly all of them in one form or another, whether they had ever been tested by something like a Carvex or not. I thought about the Academy's upcoming intake of new cadets, and about the handful of additional human applicants already listed on next semester's roster, and I felt a strange mixture of curiosity and quiet unease at the thought of an entire species like this one, slowly integrating into a galaxy built, in large part, around the old, careful rules of predator and prey. Before I left the observation deck that evening, I asked Naomi one last thing. I asked her if she had ever felt truly alone, during all those weeks of walking through the Academy's halls while everyone around her instinctively kept their distance. She considered the question for a long moment, watching the stars, and then she said that on her homeworld, this particular kind of quiet had a simple name. It was not called fear, and it was not called isolation. It was just called being calm. She said she had never really felt alone at all. She had simply been walking the way she always had, the way generations of people before her had walked through forests and mountains and open plains filled with things that could have ended them at any moment, steady, patient, and unafraid, without ever needing anyone else's understanding to make that steadiness worth carrying. I left the observation deck that night with a new appreciation for a species I had, until then, considered fascinating but ultimately unremarkable in the wider context of the Coalition's long, complicated history. I understood now that unremarkable had never been the right word at all. Weeks later, standing again near the observation rail above the training yard, I watched Naomi Clark cross the courtyard on her way to morning drills. The Predator-caste cadets around her no longer scattered or gave her careful distance. Instead, several of them fell into step beside her, walking together toward the training dome in a loose, easy formation, the earlier caution replaced by something that looked, unmistakably, like respect freely given, rather than instinctively demanded. She was no longer walking alone, but I understood, watching her, that she never truly had been. She had simply been carrying something ancient and quiet within her the entire time, something the rest of us were only just beginning to learn how to recognize, and something, I suspected, the wider galaxy was going to need a great deal more time to fully understand, as more of her kind began arriving among the stars.